I am Connie Meislick-McFadden, and I'm a psychotherapist here in Bozeman. Over the past 15 years, I've had the honor of serving as therapist to many Church Universal and Triumphant members. Some of the men and women I've worked with were and are active members of the church. Others had already left the church when I met them. They have all been deeply spiritual beings. If they had one thing in common beyond their church experience, it was that they were searching for a stronger sense of self. Carl Jung calls that the individuation process. For those who choose that path, it is a lifelong journey to consciousness and wholeness. Erin Prophet was one of my patients. As one of the daughters of Elizabeth Clare Prophet, Erin's experience was unique. Elizabeth Clare Prophet was not only Guru Ma and mother, she was and is Erin's mother, real mother. Erin struggled to understand her mother, her experience as Elizabeth Clare Prophet's daughter, and the teachings of the church that her mother led. She sought to discover the truth of her own experience and perspective. Out of that inner search for truth came the book, Prophet's Daughter. I am very pleased to introduce Erin Prophet.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have actually read Prophet's Daughter? So at least a little over half the people in the room. And for those of you who have not read it, I will try very hard not to spoil the story. Although I do believe that the story is the kind of thing that unwinds from the beginning to the end. And even if you've read page 200 and you know some of the events that happen, it's the kind of book that sort of needs to be read from beginning to end in order to really be fully appreciated, I think. So even if you're aware of some of the events, I think that you might enjoy reading it at some point. Bless you. So for anyone who has not seen the book, here it is, and it's available in a number of stores. So people are always asking me, well, is Prophet your real name? And I've even had, of course, had someone come up at one of my other readings and say, well, had you ever thought of changing your name to FIT? That's pretty standard for anyone in our family. We've heard a lot of that. And as many of you may know, our father's real last name was Prophet. And it's an English name, but he happened to believe that he had, it was his divine calling came through his name. And of course, my mother married him and became Elizabeth Clare Prophet. And I think a number of people confuse sort of what her role was and what does it mean when you call yourself a prophet versus a messenger, or, I think most newspaper articles about her start out with the idea that this is a woman who speaks for God, right, to thousands of people around the world. And one of the things I tried to explain and clarify in the book is that she really was on a sort of a dual track, because a lot of her work, a lot of what she did was about connecting people with their own sort of internal divinity and their own internal connection with God. And I think there was some people chose to go more with that side of her work, and other people chose to go more, well, if the messenger said this, then it must be, the last word. And so one of the things I explore in my book is the power structure that follows when one person is believed to have sort of a better, more accurate, more true or straight channel to the divine than everyone else. But I think it was Bette Midler who said, we're all divine, I'm just the only one who had the nerve to call myself divine. And of course she had her show, The Divine Miss B or whatever it was. And in a sense, that's sort of what my mother was like. And if you went to one of her public lectures, you'd be told, how to plug into your own divinity. So when you read somewhere, you hear that, well, she said she spoke for God. Think back, or, some people would say she thought of herself as a deity. And what does that really mean? In my opinion, being God or becoming God or in a state of becoming God really is about who has access to creative power and inspiration. And throughout history, if you look back, of course, it was only the king or the royalty that was considered to be divine. And it was not, Julius Caesar did not declare himself to be divine during his lifetime, but afterwards he was divinized, and then some of the emperors following that chose to call themselves divine. But it was really the tradition that my mother came out of was more of the democratization of divinity that happened at a time when power was being spread out, being granted to more individuals. If you look at the 2nd century time in the Roman Empire, you had the mystery religions, which were really all about personal divinity, right? And finding your own connection, your own path to God. And then as power became more concentrated and some of these traditions were hidden, then you saw divinity really being concentrated more in the church, in one specific church. So I really see my parents as spiritual pioneers. And when you say someone's a pioneer, what does that really mean? I mean, pioneers are people who go somewhere without maps. They go somewhere that no one has ever been before. They try out ideas, they try out paths. Some of them don't work, and they have to turn around and come back. And then other people know this didn't work out, we're going to try something else. And when I was trying to think, well, what of my experience with my mother do I want to put in this book, I wanted to show both her greatness, as I see as a mystic and a spiritual teacher, and also some of the paths that she went down that I felt turned out to be dead ends or not to work exactly right. So that's where I go in some of the story in here. And one of the issues that I talk about is what I would call some authoritarian remnants that sort of go along with this democratization of divinity. Some of them came through the Theosophical Society. Some of them came through the IM movement, which my parents had discovered. But if you go back and you look and you read some of their early papers and writings, which I have done both during the time when I was in the church working on my mother's biography, and since I left as her guardian and conservator, now that she has developed Alzheimer's disease, and it's now been in 10 years, a little more than 10 years since she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and she's now currently living here in Bozeman and under care. And it's been very sad and difficult for those of us in her family to watch her deteriorate, because she was an incredibly dynamic woman, very intelligent, had written 50 books or more, and as many of you know, was capable of getting up and speaking for hours at a time, and really bringing people to this direct experience of God that I think is what brought people to her and made people want to join the church. That, and also being in brotherhood and connectedness with other people who believed the same way or who wanted to have those same kinds of experiences. So one of the other themes that I explore in the book is, when someone has this kind of incredible power where they can bring people to these heights of feeling connected with everyone, with the world, with God, however you want to describe it, what does that really mean about people's obligation in relationship to them? And some of the stories I explore in the book, I go through different types of followers, because some followers were very much wanted to do everything that my mother said, and other followers took a little more time to think about some of the things, to make their own connection with God or whatever they saw as their inner reality. And so that's why there was a range of experiences. One of the reasons why I wanted to write the book is that I felt that, if you go on the internet and you Google Elizabeth Clare Prophet, what you will see is probably Wikipedia articles. You'll see some other articles, and a lot of it talks about the shelter episode of 1989, 1990, and that is where I chose to begin the story. And I think that I didn't want that to be her entire life and record. I wanted there to be some kind of a bridge out there that could show this is a human being. This is a woman who had incredible spiritual talents, as I call them, but who also was a mother and who also was a human being and was subject to some of the difficulties that any of us might have if we were told that everything we said was right and that everything we had said in the past must be right and that we couldn't change anything we'd said in the past. I think that a number of us might be led to start, making decisions that were not entirely for the best. So I look at the shelter cycle, and I've chosen to, or the shelter episode as I'm calling it, and I call it a mistake. And some people have said, well, no, it wasn't a mistake because we were following directions, and because we followed the directions, nothing happened. But as I said, there were different experiences. So some of the people in our group had made pretty minimal preparations, depending on the scenario they were thinking about. They might have put aside a few months' worth of food, some water. They might have a fallout shelter in their basement, something like that. But the shelter that was built at the ranch, I choose to use that as an example of how decision-making can really go wrong if you have someone who's believed to be entirely right. And that was really a burden on myself and my mother in the end, because it was difficult for her to tell someone, don't ask me, make up your own mind. I mean, she'd do that once in a while, but when it came to how much money should we spend, how big should these things be, how much food should we store, it kept getting bigger and bigger. And so I had thought a lot about this and what kind of lessons I might learn for the future. Well, one of the things that I learned is that it doesn't really work to try to correlate any kind of a scripture or a prophetic event with events in the real world. We've all seen examples of people doing this, and it's still going on. I was watching a program the other night about Nostradamus. And of course, as many of you know, my mother was talking about Nostradamus prophecies back in the 80s and correlating them with the Soviet threat, and Gorbachev was supposed to be the bloody one because of his forehead. And it's difficult, number one, because Nostradamus is a whole bunch of disconnected pieces of quatrains, pieces of poetry that don't necessarily have an order. So you can kind of put them in whatever order you want to. So now people are saying, even though the only Nostradamus prophecy that actually had a date in it talked about 1999. And 1999 came and went, and nothing happened, right? Nothing major in the world happened. So now people are saying that it was some kind of a numerological code that really was all about September 11th. And this program I was watching was specifically stating that. Some of my New Age friends now are looking towards the year 2012 as being something that's highly significant. It's the end of the Mayan calendar. And, I think that there are always going to be events and wars and natural disasters that we can try to correlate with different scriptures. And I think that many of us who were in the church around the time of the shelter episode remember that we were looking at Edgar Cayce. We were looking at some of the other people, not my mother, and saying, oh yes, well this is happening now too, and this is happening now too. And it's easy to see how it can sort of build on itself. And so one of the things that made a big difference for me was I read some books about how the Bible itself came to be written. And I realized that not everything my parents said could really be completely accurate, that there couldn't be just one Akashic record somewhere that had all the events that had ever taken place in the world. because, or at least if there was, we were not really able to read it. So I had to take a big step back and say, what are we really doing here? My mother came into this, of course, with a very strong Bible-based background. She never took courses in Bible history. She actually majored in political science because she felt that she already knew the Bible. She knew the scripture itself very well, the King James Version of the Bible. And at a certain point in her life, she started exploring some of the biblical scholarship that had been done, and she started looking at some of the studies of the Old and New Testament, and she started trying to incorporate it into her work. But what I think happened is that she started to lose her memory, and she really wasn't able to fully accept and articulate everything that this work meant for her message and how, because she'd already said certain things. So my feeling is that we needed a new model, and we needed a new way of looking at spirituality, and that the messengership was a box. It was almost a cage for her. And I really felt that she wanted to get out of it at a certain point, and she couldn't really, because she also cared very, very deeply for all of her followers. And she wanted to preserve and continue the work that she'd been doing and that my father had done. And that was something that was very important to me. And I think, and I'm very grateful to Connie for coming and introducing me. I had done some therapy work while I was in the church, and my mother supported and encouraged the Jungian approach and some of the therapy that I talk about in my book. But as I said, she wasn't really able to get into it too much herself or to understand the ramifications of some of it. But I had some wonderful therapists in the church who helped me, and I don't think I would be here today if they hadn't helped me sort of take apart some of my thoughts and things that were going on, because I also felt very much an obligation to the church and to all the members to want to continue the work because of what I had seen growing up and just being around the community, having friends, all the wonderful things we did with organic foods and natural healing and homeopathy. So it was very difficult for me to turn and walk away from that because of all that everyone I knew, everyone who raised me had put into it through their own work and their labor, and many of them having given their life savings. So it was difficult for me to say, well, wait a second, I think maybe this is on the wrong track. Maybe it needs to be changed a little bit. Maybe there are some lessons that could be learned from it. So what other lessons do I take away from the book? Another thing that I've been thinking about or kind of encapsulating a little bit lately is the idea that sometimes positive thinking or too much positive thinking can be negative. How could this be? Well, one of the things that we get and we read, if we go around, we read The Secret or we read The Power of Now, some of these books that people are reading, they'll tell us, be positive sort of all the time, right? And one of the things that my mother taught is that, if someone's not being positive, don't engage. If someone's negative, if they're over there swearing in their cubicle and you're sitting there trying to be happy in yours, well, send them some love, send them some positive energy, maybe send them a little bit of blue lightning energy to break up their negative energy. And of course, some of those things that we used to do with energy and with our prayer work in the church sound kind of funny. And of course, when they got the newspaper, they sounded even funnier. But what I started to think about is not so much what are these ideas about, if someone's negative, we're going to close them in light. We're going to hold them in the light, and we're of course going to try to protect ourselves from their negative energy. Well, in the end, what ends up happening is that you also don't engage and interact with that person. Try to figure out maybe what's really wrong with them. Now, not everybody did that, and there are a lot of the people in the church, would go out and actively engage with people that they thought might be their enemies, or people who might be negative, or people who might have a different point of view about something. But we did see a lot of ostracism, unfortunately, people being kicked out or asked to leave, and that's kind of endemic in many churches, and especially ones that are very Bible-based. And our church was more enlightened in a lot of ways, as I thought, and but we still had that issues about how to deal with young people, how to deal with sexuality. Those are all very important issues for any church to figure out. And I was just listening to a Christian radio broadcast on my way over here, and there was some guy who was saying that, his daughter wasn't a Christian, wouldn't pray, wouldn't go to church, occasionally used foul language, and apparently was not following a sexual code that he would want to relate to. And she's in her 30s. And he blames it all on something that might have happened when she was a child, and he wants forgiveness for that. But he's telling the radio host that his one pastor had told him, kick her out of your house. Don't let her be in the house. She's got 2 kids. Kick her out of your house. And that's in the Bible. A lot of that stuff is in the Bible. And if you think about it and you learn, the Bible itself was written by people who are trying to preserve their cultural integrity, right? Don't take wives from other tribes, So if you understand the context of some of these prophets, saying don't get involved, don't mix yourself with, other people, a lot of that was about cultural preservation. And the way I see my mother, she was a person who loved all races and all people, and she would welcome anyone to her public services. But yet in private life, and for people who were very close to her on the staff, there were a lot of people who were kicked out, asked to leave. And when that happens to you, and I've talked to a number of them, that it's really devastating. You lose all your friends, you don't have anyone to relate to. And of course, one of the things I talk about in the book is how it happened to my sister Moira. And you can see her here on the front, peeking over her mom's shoulder. And, she had some issues when she was a teenager. And I talk about that. And she wasn't able to fully, keep the rules that we had in the church. So basically what happened is, she was asked to leave and not welcome back. She has 2 small girls. And, how do you deal with that? Now, later on in the book, there is redemption, there is resolution. My mother welcomes her back into the family, and this is after the whole shelter episode. And as far as I'm concerned, this is one of the lessons that my mother learned from the shelter episode, is the danger of excluding anyone from your life because of what they practice or what they believe or don't believe. And I really came to the conclusion that if my parents' work had been allowed to continue the evolution that they had started, because remember, my mother was, started her work at a time when she was basically ostracized by Christian scientists because she had bought sayings of the Buddha. And so she was, taking a big step as far as bringing in Eastern teachings into her work. My mother was not afraid to make changes and to be revolutionary. And when she came into the work, and my father as well, that a lot of the people in the group had previously been in the I Am movement. How many of you are familiar with the I Am? A little bit, yeah. So, the I Am was a lot about positive thinking, and one of the things that they had, and they had been at their height during the 20s and 30s, they didn't allow any black people into the church. And had a similar issue with the Mormon church, which had reversed itself. But that was one of the things that my mother did, and my father as well, is to change the policy about black people. And of course, they had a pretty strong ministry in Africa. And so I have a feeling that had my mother been able to continue her work, that she might have seen the need to make some additional changes and to learn from some of what had happened. So I see another way that positive thinking can be negative is it can lead to perfectionism. And that's something that I felt my mother had held herself to a really impossible standard in some respects. And then if you don't meet that very high standard, then you feel that there's something wrong with you. And it can lead people to cover up their true desires, right? Because I shouldn't be having these feelings or desires because I am perfect or on my way to becoming perfect. I do all these decrees, I do fasting. I really should be farther along than this. So there's this sort of a little bit of spiritual one-upsmanship. And I think that this became something very difficult for my mother to deal with. I mean, people would find out that she'd eaten meat, and they would quit the church. Right? Or somebody found out that she had candida, and they quit the church. So, and she was conscious of this. So on the one hand, she wanted to reveal herself as a human being, and she was very, very open with a lot of the natural health regimens that she was on. But yet at the same time, she knew that some people, and especially people who had read in the IM books, that if you purify yourself, you can be transformed into someone like Jesus Christ, or perfected being, without even ever having to die. And that's something that is discussed in the IM books. It's possible. I'm not saying it's completely impossible that there are some people living up in the Himalayas who just translated and not had to die, and gone on living as sort of advanced spiritual beings like Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars. I don't know, but what I finally came to the conclusion is that it doesn't really work for me to try to communicate with these beings, whether or not they're out there and whether or not there's life after death. For me, I have to really work with what I can see and what I can feel. And if I have feelings of spiritual connectedness with other people or with the world, or if I feel like I'm in touch with God, that's something that I need to work with in my own creativity and inspiration and take responsibility for, rather than trying to say, well, Jesus said this to me, so you all need to listen to it. And I think that in general, we have many inspired spiritual teachers, ministers in this country, healers, and I think that the whole master dictation, messengership, channeling, I know people don't, my mother never called it channeling because her work was supposed to be coming from a higher source, but as other people would call it channeling. I think that there are a lot of dangers with that kind of work, and that's one of the lessons that I learned from my own path and from trying to do what my mother was doing. I feel positive thinking can be negative if it truncates your own growth. Because how do we grow? We grow through other people. We grow through our interactions. We grow through even people making us angry. Why is that person making me angry? Well, I don't know, but I'm going to seal myself in light and not talk to them. If we go out and we actually do interact with them, we might find that, well, maybe I have a problem with something. And, or maybe they are just a chronically angry person. But, I think that meditation, chanting, all the kinds of spiritual practices that I grew up with can be very helpful for helping people in their own lives and become better, more positive people. And that's why I'm in favor. I think the church and my mother's work has done good for many people, and I have certainly not tried to say that I don't think it should exist, or that, that religion shouldn't exist. But I do believe, and if you look at history, religion does evolve. There are many examples of that. Christianity as practiced today is very, very different from the past, even though there are various attempts at times to revive what people might think was the original form, and that which we really may never know. But Islam also evolves, and sometimes it devolves and goes backwards, because if you look at Islam of the 1930s, it was much more tolerant than the current versions of Islam. Then you have Sufism and some other works. So one of the things that I chose to talk about in the book is my own obsession, an obsession that I had. And I talk about it. I really could have told the story without mentioning it at all. I mean, I was talking about how I made the decision to leave the ranch for the first time. At that point, I really was not planning. I was planning to come back and continue my work. But how I made the decision to leave, there could have been any number of reasons. I just wanted to be out on my own. The shelter episode had gone by, and there hadn't been a war, and I felt that it was time for me to go and finish growing up. But I was so tied to the idea that I had to follow my parents' work in the way that they wanted me to, that I really couldn't bring myself to leave. And so what happened, I became caught up in obsessive thoughts, and I started to think that there was something really wrong with me, and that maybe I didn't deserve to live, and maybe I should, kill myself or something. And these were all the kinds of things that some people have dealt with during episodes of depression or whatever. But the reason I chose to talk about my obsession in the book is because it taught me a different way of dealing with problems and with people that I hadn't learned so far in my work in the church. I mean, in general, the way we're taught and the way, if you read The Power of Now, right, what you're told is if you're having a thought, put it away, right? Just push it away. Don't think about it. Put it into the flame, dissolve it in the light. Well, that may work sometimes, and it has worked for a number of people, but what I think happens there is that you're not really looking at the need about why is this thought returning? Why does this thought keep coming back to me? And what I was able to do through my work with Connie, with some other therapists, is to realize, oh, this thought has gotten so big in my mind because I'm not looking at this whole other piece of me and at perhaps some of the, what I might call the shadow side of life in the church. I'm not looking at that stuff. I'm hiding it all. I'm pushing it all away. So this thought keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so for me, it was about trying to get to the bottom. Well, what does this really symbolize? Is this about the person that I'm obsessed with? There are plenty of people who commit murders because they're obsessed, right? So for me, it was about, no, it's not really about the person I'm obsessed with at all. This person simply symbolizes something that I'm not able to look at in any other way. And so I was able to gradually pull that back, take it back through some dream work that I had done and through the therapy. And so I realized that that was a very important way of looking at the world that really hadn't come through in the positive thinking and some of the spiritual techniques that I had learned. So it doesn't mean I don't think the spiritual techniques are valuable, and I know many people have had a hard time with some of the things I've said in the book, people who have been in the church for a long time. The idea seeming to be that if I can't accept my mother, if I can't accept that she was everything she said she was, then I must, be a bad person, or I must be, painting her all black. And that's not really the case. And so another thing I learned through my work is the dangers of black and white thinking, right? The dangers of thinking that we're all good and they're all bad. So I think that there's been a lot of soul searching among current and former members of the church since this episode happened. But I do think that some of the ideas that led to some of what I call the poor decision making around the shelter episode, those ideas are still at work today. And I think it's part of why I don't really feel the church has been able to come into what I would say the 21st century and really learn. One of the things that I think is not helpful is the practice of decreeing against other people's energy. And not so much because I don't think that any harm can come. I mean, obviously when we were doing prayers against people's energy, what we always thought, well, this is all for God's will, this is all for God's love, but we were also asking to have all their karma come back on them instantaneously so that they wouldn't be able to attack us anymore. I think those were some of the prayers that we would do. Now, many of those people that we said decrees about and asked for their karma to come back upon them, including my dear sister Moira, are alive and well today, and nothing bad ever happened to them. So that's pretty much proof that the decrees don't hurt people. But the thing I think they do is they hurt the people that are giving them sometimes, because when you're giving decrees like that against a person's energy, you really don't feel like calling them up on the phone and talking to them. And one of the things that I talk about, I don't think I had room to talk about this in the book, is that at one time, when my mother had problems with Gregory Mull, and there was a lawsuit back in 1986, well, Gregory believed very much in the teachings, and yet at the same time he had gotten to this difficult financial situation, and he wasn't able to pay back a loan that he'd gotten from the church. When he left the church, he was decreeing against my mother, and she was decreeing against him. And so that really didn't lead to, in my opinion, what could have been potential for resolution. And even though they did actually sit down in a room and talk for 3 hours, I think that there was a certain amount of demonization that went on. And some of that comes out of Bible teaching, some of it comes out of IM and other work. And so, I think this is another thing that we need to learn. I actually have written down 4 points that I think the current church should change if they truly want to move forward into the future. First of all, I think they should formally and publicly abandon the practice of identifying any living person as a fallen angel. My sister was identified as a fallen angel. So were the Beatles. So were, other people that were decreed against for a long time. I don't think it's helpful for the group to think that we somehow have the ability to tell. I don't know whether there is such a thing as a fallen angel embodiment. I do know that my mother, as I said, reconciled with my sister. And I find it ironic that my sister was welcomed back to the ranch for the 50th anniversary celebration this summer, but I was asked not to attend because I don't know if anyone has formally declared me a fallen angel, but it just goes to show sort of what that can do. I think that it would be a good idea to allow more free and open dialogue in an open forum rather than only having people come to controlled situations. So that's point number 1, abandon identifying fallen angels in embodiment, because it truncates resolution. My mother, one of the last things my mother did before she lost her memory was that she changed the bylaws of the church so that members of the church, would have more say in what direction the church took. And I think there are a number of Christian denominations that have gone this way. I think Episcopalian Church, the Quakers, in my understanding, have more of a participatory group. Of course, the Catholic Church is still very hierarchical, and I think one of the things I'd heard is that Pope Benedict has said, if we're going to be a smaller church, so be it. I've heard that some of the ministers currently running my mother's church have also said, if we're going to be a smaller church, so be it. I think that what's happened is that the current church has actually changed the bylaws so that there is no real room for members to make changes. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a step in the wrong direction, and it's rescinding my mother's really last conscious wish. As far as I'm concerned, changing the bylaws was her apology. That was her way of saying, don't leave it all up to me, And I think that if this grand experiment that my parents started and that many of my friends and family were a part of, if it is to make it and continue into the future, that it needs to at least go back to the participatory form. They need to also reinstate due process. Due process means that you can't be kicked out for no reason. Of course, churches have always been about sort of who's in and who's out, right? You couldn't have a church if you didn't have something to define it. Religion probably evolved as a way to have within-group charity as a way for groups to help a group survive. So I'm not suggesting that there be no rules, but I am suggesting that people should not be asked to leave simply for questioning the leadership or for making suggestions about how things might be changed or for advocating a certain course. Really, that's not helpful. Even the Catholic Church has some kind of process that has to be gone through before someone can be excommunicated. And finally, I believe, and this is something that my mother strongly felt, is that if you want to attend more than one church, you should be free to do that. And if someone wants to attend another group. And for those of you who are not at all familiar with Church Universal and Triumphant, there are several other groups that have now been started by former members who are now doing their own channeling and dictation work. And I talk about that a little bit in the book, but I don't think that one group should say, well, you can't be in our group if you're in theirs. You know, to me, that's continuing the exclusionary practices that led to so many problems. I love and respect, honor, and appreciate my mother for everything she taught me, everything she brought into my life, and for all the love that she gave me. And finally, I will just read a little passage from the book, and then I'll open up the floor to questions. This is from page 35. I'm talking about sort of what my mother's work was like and who were the kinds of people that she attracted to her. The thing about my mother was that she could act so normal at times, occasionally popping in to play softball with our high school team, hitting a volleyball on the beach with the staff, and dancing a foxtrot. Sitting on that platform in the tent, she did not look like someone who would soon close her eyes and begin to channel. Her sheer ordinariness was enough to dispel the claims that she was psychotic or suffering from multiple personality disorder, with which she had been diagnosed by a caller to one of her radio interviews. But many people did claim to experience altered states during her dictations. Almost everyone in the tent had witnessed a dictation, and as she concluded her greeting and opening lecture, they prepared to receive the light by closing their eyes and sitting up straight. She took a seat in one of the upholstered chairs at the side of the altar, closed her eyes, and began listening to Pomp and Circumstance, one of many classical pieces she used to help her tune in to the masters. As it concluded, my mother stood, walked to the center of the stage, and began speaking in the words of the master named El Moria. Her voice was slow and deliberate, her eyes closed much of the time. This dictation lasted for nearly an hour and ranged from a discussion of our own spiritual development to what was the purpose of the ranch. As I sat in the front row watching her speak, I firmly believed, along with most others in the tent, that behind her stood a bearded, turbaned master. I used to try to tune in and catch the broadcast myself. I imagined that something was spiritually wrong with me because, unlike many of the followers, I had never seen any of the masters. However, I did often feel what I believed was the radiation, or light energy, emitted by the master. It felt like heat and a tingling sensation of being gathered up into a point and then diffused and dissolved in a radiant sea. This was ecstasy, which means to stand outside of oneself. Although there were plenty of dictations during which I zoned out or fell asleep, I also occasionally felt lifted outside myself, and at the time I associated this feeling exclusively with my mother and with our meditations and decrees. At one point, my mother, as El Moria, seemed to be speaking directly to me, telling me that the way to God was to draw a straight line, walk in it, look straight as an arrow to the highest peak, and watch the gleam of the sun at dawn glisten there, and know that at the summit of every mountain is a diamond waiting for you to take it and make it your own. I took a deep breath and tried to focus my mind on that diamond, to become one with it and with my mother and El Moria, my earthly and heavenly gurus, the outer teaching becoming inner teaching. We are one, not many diamonds, but one conglomeration of stars, merging into a galactic center. It would be a decade before I began to doubt that communication with masters was possible, and another decade before I ceased to care. For the moment, I was intensely curious about how my mother had been chosen and trained to take on this role. And when I say I ceased to care, it's not that I mean that I don't care at all about that sense of ecstasy and the spiritual energy that I felt. It simply means that I've decided that there is no objective way to verify whether or not a master is speaking through someone. I know many people believe that they have the ability to tell, right? They can tell when someone is or is not, or when the message is true and when it's not. All I can say is that's a pretty big responsibility to take upon yourself, and I think it's a mistake to walk away from all that we have as members of the human race, and all that we can learn from each other as well. as from our spiritual teachers. So with that, I'd like to open up the floor to questions. I really appreciate you all coming out tonight. I know some of you, some of the faces I do recognize from our long years in the church, and some people I imagine are here because they'd like to learn more, so I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes?
Let me start with a friendly observation. Your mother married and became a prophet. You married and became divine.
That's very true. I was going to make a joke about that my second husband's last name was Divine, so I went from being Erin Prophet to Erin Divine for a while, and now I'm back to Prophet, but mainly because it's my name and I don't have another one.
Anyway, I know. But there was something curious about something that I learned when I was involved with the cycle of the release of the information about the Alzheimer's and the epilepsy. Mm-hmm. I was a victim of epilepsy for all of her life.
Sure.
Which had not been disclosed until the San Antonio conference.
Right, and is that in 1996, I think?
Was it?
Something like that, I think so.
And in that process, I was hired to go interview Dr. Lepic and put together a little documentary about the situation to kind of help the community to understand and to come to grips with this transformation that was inevitable, that was occurring.
Sure.
And that your mother was going through certain crisis of confidence at that point. She knew that she couldn't sustain that role. And it became a huge burden for her, so much so that they had to sit in the room with her or she would jump in a taxi and leave. Despite all of the obligations and the promises that she would be there. So it was a very, very hard time for her to try to deal with while her mind was becoming more and more dysfunctional and her memory was, ebbing. How difficult it was for her, for you, for the family to have to go through and see that transition. And then what was curious about it, what I want to have your insight on, she became fixated, it seemed to me, with her latest son becoming the heir apparent, so to speak, so that she would be able to have something genetic to continue the thing. So there was this sort of preoccupation with nepotism, despite how often she would decry what she would call the flesh and blood consciousness. And yet, even you, in a sense, were a victim of that nepotistic attitude. What do you think was behind all of that? Why this nepotism and why this fixation with wanting to have a genetic inheritor kind of thing? Do you understand? What was that?
Well, there was a kind of a built-in contradiction in the work because of a lot of the early Eastern teachings that said that, high souls would be born to high souls, and if my parents were the sort of most spiritually evolved people on the planet, then they would have very highly evolved children. And I also think that my mother felt some of my father's energy as a messenger, that it would be transmitted through his children. And also there was the whole idea that we were, meant to bring in the new age. So I think that it was very important, yes, to my mother to have someone of her blood to inherit the work. And it's unfortunate because there were many other very capable leaders in the group that ended up being forced out at different times because they had developed a following or they were, getting too charismatic or popular. And that's one of the reasons why I think she tried to restructure, because she knew that she couldn't do it all herself, but at the same time it was also very difficult to take complete step back and get out of the decision-making role. So, any other questions? Yes?
Erin, I kind of had an outline in my head of the steps kind of that your mother took to become what she became, the spiritual teacher that she became, but I don't have that distinct of an outline of what pivotal events in your dad's life led him to become a messenger. Can you point to any kind of outer circumstances that led him, pointed him in that direction?
Well, there are the stories that he told about being called as a teenager and then, taking him 20 years to kind of get the message. when I looked at his papers, what I saw is that it was more of an evolutionary process, that he had gone through Rosicrucianism. How many people know what Rosicrucianism is? A few people, yeah. So Rosicrucianism is basically a mystical form of Christianity that talks about God being inside of you, that talks about Jesus being sort of our elder brother, that we're meant to become like him, that uses a lot of meditation. And my dad was involved in that for a long time. And a lot of his writings and even some of the things like the ashram notes came out of that work. Then he began reading some books called Life and Teachings of the Masters of the Far East, which were written by a guy named Baird Spalding. How many people, I know I keep asking you to show of hands, how many people have read or seen these Life and Teachings books? Yeah, so a lot of people who may have been in the church have seen those books. And it's funny because I went back and I read some of them, and I also read about them. And these books tell the story of a group of scientists going to India in the 1930s and documenting these miraculous occurrences with masters, walking on water, multiplying bread, being able to bring forth money and food out of nowhere. So a lot of the kinds of miracles that Jesus performed were supposedly being performed by these masters in India. Now, what the truth is that the Spalding guy who wrote the books had never been to India, was not part of this group of scientists, and he was really, what I call it, playing a variation on a theme. The theme being the Rosicrucian idea that you have God inside of you and that Jesus was our elder brother, we're meant to become like him. So Spalding conceived this wonderful, miraculous story and journey, and it inspired a lot of people. I mean, some very intelligent people read these books. Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture in the 1920s, had read them. And at the time, there was not a lot of fact-checking, verification going on. Then an interesting thing, though, is that the publishing company that published Spalding's books, which is Divorce and Company, they actually published a book written by the man who knew Baird Spalding. It's called Baird Spalding, As I Knew Him. And it tells the story of how Baird Spalding was really this kind of, not a very together guy, always kind of had his hand out to get money from people. He wrote these books, he became really rich and famous. But he would always spend his money. And so he was sort of a prototype I am person. Now, just because he made up the story that, masters in India were doing all these things and that it's been scientifically verified, does that mean that the whole teaching is wrong or is bunk? Not necessarily. The teaching, the ideas themselves are based on, earlier works. And so to me, I say it's important, I think, to separate the ideas out from some of the phenomenon, some of the miraculous claims that were made. And, I know that even today people go and study monks, and they have recorded some amazing things, like monks being able to heat their bodies up to a high temperature, stay warm in the snow, things like that through their meditation. So I'm not saying that everything that everybody has ever said about these monks in the Himalayas is not true, but I think that the Spalding books contributed to this whole perfectionism idea, that if you continue walking this path, you're going to, as I said, just sort of walk out of your body into godhood and not have to go through old age and death and some of the things that we've all had to go through. So, I think there needs to be some moderation. So as far as your question, Doug, about how my dad got there, he had read the Spalding books. He'd read the Rosicrucian work. Then he came in contact with the I Am work, and he decided that he was meant to be a messenger. But it took him a while, and he was already preaching sermons that sounded a lot like dictations, even before he had come in touch with that work. So that's the other thing that I believe about my parents, is that they evolved into their roles a little more than what perhaps the standard line might have been. Yes?
So do you think that meditation is more like, once they have this philosophy, they are able just to elaborate on it and is in a very own way, but they just understand it so well that, wow, it's everybody.
Well,
I mean, instead of like really listening, just voices from ours.
Yeah, I don't think that the dictations were written down somewhere and that my parents were just reading them off of an invisible page. I think that it was sort of a meshing of their own creative energy with a lot of these pre-existing ideas and concepts that they had learned from their work. And, that may be a shock to some people who have really enjoyed the dictations, but I think it's a more healthy way to look at them. And I know my parents probably wouldn't have condoned that way of looking at them, but I think in the end it's the only thing to do. Is there a question in the back?
Yeah, there's 3, maybe 4 people who now claim to be the true messengers. What's your impression of these people?
Well, I haven't spent a lot of time listening to or reading their work, but, from what I have read, I see a lot of it as being derivative of my parents' work, and for that it would be comforting to some of the people who are in their groups. But I also see a tendency to carry on some of the same sort of negative ideas that, I was reading one of them the other day online, somebody sent me, and it says, something will happen. Something will happen this year. Prepare, be ready, watch and wait. The bridegroom cometh. Which is sort of, and it was, I think it was talking about terrorism and kind of like be prepared and have food and water handy, which is not a bad idea, right? We've learned that, since Hurricane Katrina and 9/11 and everything, it's not a bad idea to have some food and water. But I think for people to try to connect that with, if you're not good spiritually and you don't do your prayer work, then this bad thing really will happen. I think that's sort of a guilt trip that's put on people. I think your spirituality has to come from inside, not because you are afraid that, God is going to unleash bad karma on the world if you don't do your spiritual work. So I think that, these new messengers obviously are fulfilling a role in people's lives, but I think it might be good if they also took a look at some of the work. I know that the Temple of the Presence is very involved in continuing the I am work, and I see some of what I would call the shadow side, or the dark side of the I am would continue to come out in some of that work. So yeah, thank you. Anyone else have a question?
Yeah, you said we made some mistakes in the shelter cycle, and you had 4 ways that this specific church could change for the better. So you must have plenty of fertile ideas for organizations. Could you tell me what an ideal church would look like?
What would I think an ideal church or spiritual group might look like? I have to say I don't know, because I haven't ever seen one, but one of the things that one of the conclusions I've come to after the reading and the studying that I've done over the past 15 years is that I think you don't have to know in order to try. You don't have to know what's the perfect matrix, that perhaps there's not some perfect form, like, going back to the Neoplatonic forms, and the idea that all we have to do is bring it into existence as a full-grown perfect thing. I think that what's important is to have something which has the capacity to change and grow and evolve in order to meet people's needs for spiritual mystical connection, which hadn't been met in traditional churches, and which was why people were looking to my mother's work and other New Age work for sustenance. I think a church should contain charitable giving to people who are not part of the group. I think that's important. I think that it would be a good idea if churches offered free therapy to people. Like what I got when I was fortunate enough to get from Connie and from other people I've worked with, a lot of people don't get, and we see them getting into drugs. We see them killing themselves. We see them going out and committing violent acts because they don't have somebody to help them pick it apart and take a few steps back. And I think it's really too bad that right now psychotherapy is about you get your 3 office visits and you get a Prozac prescription, really, and that's what it is. So if you want to get real therapy, you have to pay for it yourself, and you have to be fortunate enough to be able to afford it. So I think that would be something I'd like to see churches offering more of, because that's the role that the village shaman or the church occupied in the past. And that's one of the reasons why people feel so disenfranchised, or people might come here from another country, they don't have a way of fitting in, so they become a Mormon, or a Scientologist or whatever, and they find a group that they can readily identify with. And it may take a while for them to figure out that, hey, we're excluding all, God's not to exclude the whole world. So I would like to see a way of being spiritual that did not necessarily involve someone having to accept a creed. I think that that's, whether it's the Nicene Creed or whether it's tenets of a church, I don't think you have to have that in order to get your spiritual needs met. Why should you have to believe or have faith? So that's...
I think your insight about a church having a tenant that says it's okay to be part of other churches, I think that's so amazing, because it gives, I guess, the okay to the person that's attending that church, and it's okay to explore. I mean, why wait for the box to change when you can go check a different box and see what's over there, and it might be good for you, it might be just what you need, but a lot of the times when when you're there and they tell you you can't go anywhere else and you're in a meeting and whatever person, they're not gonna disobey or whatever. So that would be like one amazing thing that would, any church or any group or any organization, a Democrat or a Republican, sometimes they're like this, they don't want to go out of their group. And it's sad, because I think more growth comes.
Yeah. Well, it's an exciting time for spirituality in America. I think there are a lot of people who've grown up in very restrictive groups who may be looking for, for different ways of interacting. Any other questions? Yeah, it's right there.
Your thinking and your speaking, to your credit, run a lot faster than my pencil. Would you please review the 4 things that you would like to see the church be able to do?
Oh, sure, I'm happy to. I would like, and I've actually written a letter to the church with at least 2 or 3 of these things in it. I'd like them to formally abandon the practice, or, the church doesn't really do this, but individual members do. But I would, even if individual members are going to keep doing it, I think that the church itself should state that it doesn't condone that any more than the Mormon church any longer condones polygamy. Abandon the practice of identifying fallen angels in embodiment or as living people. That's number 1. Number 2 is to return the bylaws to their basically 1995 state, I believe it was, so that there can be more participation by groups, by the members in what happens to the church. I see the church, the role the church should be, of a church universal and triumphant, should be as custodians for my parents' work and facilitators of their project, but not as lawgivers or arbiters of spiritual destiny. That wasn't in my points, but reinstate due process so that people cannot be kicked out without a good reason, and the reason should not include disagreeing with the leadership or criticizing hierarchy, as it's called. And finally, that people should be free to attend whatever group they want to, and that they should not be excluded or banned for that. And these kinds of issues, and for those of you here who are not or didn't ever have anything to do with Church Universal and Triumphant, it may sound like, this is a lot of discussion of very fine points. But these are the kinds of questions that many churches who've grown up along the Christian model have to deal with, and it's not unique to United States Christianity. I mean, in India, you've got the caste system, which is, not necessarily religious, but, so it's, as the world changes and evolves, I think, and I hope that these barriers will be broken down. Any other questions?
As you know, there were sometimes people that would become overnight pariahs to the community that they loved and that they may have committed 30 years to, 10 years to, 15 years to. I'm wondering if you have had any outreach to such individuals to help them overcome whatever pain that caused, what sort of confusion that would create. Because there seems to be a tremendous injustice and a capriciousness in how that all came about and why it came about. I can think of half a dozen people offhand that happened to that just didn't make sense to me. These are great people, and to devastate their lives like that. Have you been in contact with these and tried to help them come to some better understanding?
Well, I have heard from, a number of people who had that experience. There hasn't really been a whole lot that I could do to make it better, because I don't have another group that they can be a part of. But I think some of them have come to a healing or balance on their own. But I also know many people 10, 20 years later still feel like they're out in the cold, still feel like they don't have the kinds of friendships that they made in the group. And some of that is a function of that it's so easy to make friends in a group where you kind of know that you share the same values, and it's done all at once. And then when you leave, your friendships are on a one-to-one basis, and they don't all, you can't always get together on the same level. So I don't know. I hope that something can evolve out of this, and that people can find a better way of interacting. Oh, yes, you in the orange or peach.
How many people are members now of the church?
I really don't know. I know that, of course, a lot of people left after the shelter episode, but also new people have joined. In fact, it's my understanding that much of the current church leadership, at least half of the board, are people who joined after the shelter episode. So, and one of the things I talk about is, how groups continue on even after, like, a prophecy might not come true or something like that. Sorry, did you have another question?
Do you see yourself as ever returning to the church or having a part in carrying on and making these 4 changes you've suggested?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I very much care about the church, but I feel that, I may have evolved to a place where I can't be a part of it. I don't know. I mean, I offer these observations because of what I've seen in the past 10 years, I had thought that the church would go on along the restructured model, and that I didn't need to be a part of it. But, I don't entirely rule it out, but it would have to be really completely different organization.
Do you have the heritage to just step back?
Huh? Well, a lot of people have said, why don't you go and take it back? But, the way the structure is now, that would pretty much be impossible. And I don't know that it's something I really want to give my life to anyway. I mean, I think that there are a lot of really talented, charismatic, creative people. I see my friend, the Reverend Catherine Takano, here in the second row, and she's become a minister of all faiths, and she conducts ceremonies for people. I mean, there are so many people who were in the church who I would say have some kind of a calling or a charisma about them. And I would like to see them, continue to develop and meet people's needs as they feel called to do.
I'd like to say something very personal to you, publicly. I've known you since you were, whatever year it was, when was the last year that the organization was in Pasadena?
1977
77.
or 78, something like
Or something like
Yeah.
that. And I watched you do all of those plays on stage, and how much heart and mind and commitment that you return to the community. And I'll just say thank you. You were a light and a blessing through many, many years.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for being there. You can't have a community without people in it, and it was a special experience that we all had. And my desire would be that we all were able to take the best of what we had together and build upon it. Well, looks like anybody else? Any more questions? All right, well, I just want to thank you all so much for coming.